Welcome to the Reason Roundtable podcast, your weekly libertarian podcast brought to you by the magazine of free minds and free markets. I am Matt Welch, joined as per holiday tradition by Nick Gillespie, Peter Suderman, and Katherine Mangu-Ward. Happy video test drive, everyone.
Howdy.
Happy Monday.
All right. Let's just get into it. Could this, Nick Gillespie, really be the end, oh mama? I'm talking about yesterday's withdrawal from the GOP presidential race by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, but in ways that I don't think America has fully processed. Could also be talking about tomorrow's New Hampshire primary in both parties. Could be the last real gasp for major party political competition before the seemingly inevitable and incredibly unpopular Trump-Biden rematch, death match, cage match. That would be, if this indeed transpires in such a way, 41 weeks. We'd be watching these two old codgers. Here's how the math works. Trump last week, as we know, became the biggest non-incumbent winner of the Iowa caucus in its history. He's up by more than 20 percentage points in New Hampshire in direct head-to-head polling against Nikki Haley. New Hampshire is basically the state where there are the most independents, and independents have the biggest ability to vote. So if she can't make it there, it's arguable that she won't be able to make it anywhere, including her home state of South Carolina, which is the next major caucus in February 24th. Trump there is up in sparse polling by 30 percentage points. So if Haley gets clobbered tomorrow, her campaign might go into kind of actuarial mode, by which
I think it's called clinical death or brain death.
Well, waiting for said clinical brain death of the competition. If she is in second place and something happens to the first place person, as Vivek Ramaswamy has been warning us, then she would have the most delegates in theory. On the Democratic side, there admittedly isn't much of a chance for three-time Congressman Dean Phillips, Talenti is Dean Phillips, but Biden
he's the ice cream guy?
He's the ice cream man.
Wow.
God wouldn't satisfy.
Or is it Spumoni?
It's definitely Talenti.
We love that Tahitian vanilla.
Talenti is great, cream. Right?
It's a little overpriced.
Well, you buy it at CVS, and what you do at CVS is you just walk out with it. That's their whole new policy. It's been that way for
until
a couple
Trump
of years.
is president, at which point people who just walk out with stuff at CVS are going to be shot. Is what he says.
They'll be shot in all caps.
It's like Judge Dredd. It's like Judge Dredd's world. Matt, can we
as long as we can call out the very special kind of bullets that are going to come out of your science fiction gun?
Can we just start talking about the Trump-Biden you called it a death match, but that would imply that one of them is still alive.
Here's my proposal for this podcast. I will moderate it, Nick Gillespie.
Okay.
So the Biden, as mentioned before, although I didn't, is a write-in in New Hampshire. So this is really the last stand, the only stand for Dean Phillips. And he's putting all of his money on the early state project. But Biden is incredibly unpopular incumbent, as Nick pointed out last week. He is less popular at this stage in his presidency than any president in the history of modern polling, and Democrats by pretty large margins, or at least in large shares, have been saying all along they don't want him to run, which is not a great sign for the incumbent. So if anything is to happen at all in his primary, that's basically Tuesday. So it is possible that on Wednesday morning, we're going to wake up and this is what we have, the Trump-Biden cage match. So Katherine, last week on this podcast, we let our resident Florida man, Peter Suderman, deliver his kind of eulogy for the DeSantis campaign. But now that he's out, would you care to sprinkle any more dirt or maybe flowers on Meatball Ron's grave and what his implosion says about the state of the modern Republican Party, at least on the national level?
I can't stop thinking about the fake Churchill quote. For those who are living good and wholesome lives and did appropriate weekend activities and don't know this, DeSantis gave his farewell remarks and did a tweet of them as well. And he wrapped up with the Churchill quote that Churchill did not say. Success is not final. Failure is not final. It is the courage to continue that counts is a thing Churchill did not say. But
but this does mean he's in the running to become the next president of Harvard now. That he's
that's right.
Not only a plagiarist, but a fake plagiarist.
A fake plagiarist.
I think he put quotes around the quote. That wasn't real.
One more, the final entry for DeSantisLies.com, if Nikki Haley is still updating it. This will just sit at the top of that site until maybe 2024.
Was it Nikki Haley or Nancy Pelosi who was running that site? I'm having more and more trouble picking them apart.
Deep questions. So DeSantis, our Reason's own Eric Boehm has been our kind of DeSantis correspondent, and his original profile of DeSantis made the point that he governed quite competently in Florida in many ways, other than the gross speech restrictions and, corporate scapegoating. But he did some good stuff during COVID. He could have run on that. He chose not to. And the thing he chose didn't work. We'll never know the alternate history where Ron DeSantis ran on something resembling a pro-freedom ticket. But I sure would have liked to live in that universe instead of the one that we are in fact in.
In Eric Boehm's piece this morning, I think he makes a really good point when he asks, what was DeSantis's signature policy proposal? Like, what was this guy running on? What was his vision of the future? And if you go back and look through his campaign, you can see a vibe in it, right? There is a tendency that DeSantis expresses. But you can't point to a big idea about government that DeSantis was like, this is what I am going to do and what I am going to press for when I am president. And beyond that, you can't see a sort of a vision of the world that is different, that is really fundamentally different from ours, except, well, Joe Biden won't be president and we won't do so much woke stuff. And I don't know, maybe gas prices will be cheaper. But that's kind of it. It's not a compelling vision of the world. And there's no big idea about what government should be doing that it's not doing. And I think it's really hard to run on that. I mean, Trump has a bunch of bad, crazy ideas, but he expresses a clearer vision, actually, I think, for what America should be. Not one that is plausible, not one that I agree with in a lot of respects, but he expresses a clearer and more compelling vision for what America should and could be than DeSantis ever did.
Nick, 1 week ago, DeSantis said that nominating Trump would deliver the reelection to Joe Biden. And further said that, quote, you can be the most worthless Republican in America, but if you kiss the ring, he'll say you're wonderful. If you don't kiss that ring, then he'll try to trash you. Then when DeSantis withdrew yesterday, instead of endorsing the competition or just sitting on his hands, he immediately endorsed Trump. What do you think of our ring-kissing era?
Feels like an acknowledgement that he's the worst Republican in America, actually.
He deep-throated the ring. Right?
No, thank you.
I think DeSantis, Peter, makes a strong argument that, there was just no idea there. Ron DeSantis was like the Ozzie Canseco politics. He's a shitty, younger version of the real thing. Jose Canseco, Matt, Trump is still around. You don't need a less original Trump. I think he made the big mistake of going hard on Top Gun advertisements that were all, by all accounts, engineered by his wife, Casey, who really should be removed from his campaign advising. And he should have gone with, if he's going with a Tom Cruise movie from the 80s, he should have gone with Cocktail. Where you have a scrappy guy coming up with a new plan for a whole new chain of cocktail restaurants that are family friendly in malls, and he can do a lot of really cool moves with the liquor bottles. DeSantis,
I will juggle liquid for you, is a better idea for America.
He offered nothing at a national level. He's been a very successful and good governor of Florida, and he won by a massive reelection. I know a bunch of liberal and progressives who, talk about living in DeSantis's Florida, and they're like, I don't particularly care for the guy, but it is not, Italy under Mussolini. It's not fascist. It's not bad. It's actually a pretty good place to live. And he should have spent most of his time discussing how he brought that about and how he would bring that about in the rest of the country. And he chose not to. Culture war is not going to work.
Feels like we maybe could be aiming for, it feels like we could be aiming for better than it's not Italy under Mussolini. I just feel like we can do better.
Well,
Peter, I heard you being strangled.
Something risky business. Something 80s movies. Go ahead.
All the right moves. No.
Yeah,
okay.
that's it. No. What 1980s movie should he have run on? Days of Thunder.
Yeah.
Right, with the wheelchair race. And I mean, it's just a great movie about cars. And
the only movie.
Cars are carbon. Unless it's an electric car race. I don't know. I think that's out of step with the time.
That's the remake.
The only cinematic metaphor for our lives is Death Race 2000, the absolute classic early Sly Stallone picture from the 70s. Katherine, I was struck this morning by a tweet, as usual, from Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts, who wrote, quote, Governor DeSantis has an extremely bright future in the conservative movement. While we all rally around our movement's leader, President Trump, we also know that the future of conservative policies will be in how effectively we implement Trumpian conservatism. There is no one other than President Trump himself, sorry, am I laughing, who has done more in that regard than Governor DeSantis. So I thank him immensely for showing what the future of our movement and the country is. Now let's go take back this country united and resolved on behalf of the forgotten American. Is this a healthy way for a public policy think tank to behave?
I personally do not love it. I think there could be, some bad secondary effects of this theory in which we craft public policy retroactively once Donald Trump says something. Like we just wait for him to talk, and then we're like, oh yeah, that's what conservatism is. That's hasn't gone well so far. In fact, our own Stephanie Slade has been writing for years about how a lot of the kind of tradcon, theocon, new right movement is an effort to do just this. It's okay. It looks like Trump is here and he's going to be around. We need to create an intellectual movement and a sort of policy plan and, underpinnings and overpinnings to legitimize Trumpism. Heritage has been taking the lead on this. And as a strategic matter, it makes sense for Heritage to do this, which I hate. As a matter of what will be good for the country, it's a disaster. And I think, we've not seen the last of this. It's going to require kind of increasingly difficult intellectual gymnastics to make this mission a reality, including saying stuff like, oh, what's actually true is that Ron DeSantis is just like the practical embodiment of Trumpism. No, he was running against him. He's a different thing. And he will be denying that going forward. Trump will be denying that going forward. Heritage will be denying that going forward. But there are different versions of conservatism out there besides Trumpism, and it would be great to keep that in mind because we're going to need those when Trumpism finally inevitably implodes and eats its own young.
It remains underappreciated that in 2020, the last time Trump was the Republican presidential nominee, the Republican Party simply did not release a new policy platform. They were just like, nope, we're not going to have one. We'll find out what it is when Trump says stuff.
You have to elect him to find out what's in it. Yeah.
I think Heritage should change its name to Heirloom. Wouldn't you? I would give them a check if they were like, no, we were the Heirloom Institute or whatever. The Heirloom
When I check my promotions tab, I'm always a little bit confused between the stuff that comes from Heritage, the think tank, and Banana Republic, which has a Heritage collection.
Yeah.
Let's go quickly to a kind of a lightning round about New Hampshire. Anything that any of us are looking forward to tracking, interesting, and watching developments happen on Tuesday. Katherine, lead us off.
Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
lightning.
going to be Trump v. Biden. And I guess New Hampshire will be interesting to see what happens. I like that their ballot has like 87 people on it, including Vermin Supreme, who I don't think we've discussed in this election
I'm
cycle.
wearing right now. I stole this from him.
What?
I stole a tie from Vermin Supreme, and I'm wearing it on this podcast.
No, I mean, I heard your words, but what?
Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
okay. Vermin Supreme was running for the Libertarian Party presidential nomination last time around. And I went and covered a lot of the conventions on that circuit. And he would show up with his boot on his head. Sometimes he would take it off during like the pre-debate
You really
suppers.
don't want to see that, right?
You do.
Like,
I'm
that's like when they take the iron plate off of somebody and they have just like a pulsing brain there.
Oh, I thought it was like when people start like taking off their earrings before like a fight. Like when he takes the boot off,
the
stuff's getting real.
The boot, it's just like it's beyond hair, hat hair. When he takes that boot off.
I finally took off my earrings for good when I was woken up by a dog had chewed off one of my rings. Hoops. What I just did that
like every morning
funded
for me.
his campaign by selling ties. Clearly would go to a thrift store and buy a tie for 10 cents and then put like some vajazzled like Vermin Supreme thing on it. So or Vermjazzled, I should say.
This
is what happens when we go to video.
I know I asked you to say more, but I now want you to say less.
Anywho, so Catherine's got a nothing. Anyone, Nick, are you looking, is there anything that you're tracking in particular for tomorrow?
What I'm most interested in is to see if there is a crack in Biden's wall of support. And I guess it's not Spumoni. I want a Spumoni candidate, but I'll settle for a gelato magnate. And if the gelato magnate or none of the above, or people just don't turn out for Biden, I think that could be interesting. And
he's
also
a liquor distiller, Nick, trying to get Suderman back.
Well, I think we've had that as presidents before, right? Or the scion of bootlegging and stuff.
He really is running on returning to the 1980s Tom Cruise cocktail situation.
No, but it's in the making. Anything could be in those bottles as long as he's throwing them high up in the air while singing the hippie hippie shake. I don't know what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is up to, but
15 percentage point. 15%
I don't know how that
freeway rest.
I don't know how that plays out in New Hampshire, though. But the thing to watch, really, I think, is whether or not Biden is, if the specter of Eugene McCarthy is floating around there somewhere.
So the pre-election polls in New Hampshire have been more or less, and they're not in front of my face, but Biden around 60, Dean Phillips around 10, Marianne Williamson around 5. Not a very a fruitful
polls
thing.
are a snapshot, Matt.
Polls are a snapshot, but also in New Hampshire, and this also potentially affects the Nikki Haley-Donald Trump race, independents who outnumber Democrats and Republicans registered, independents in the New Hampshire primary are allowed to walk up to the polling booth and say, okay, I'm going to vote in this one, and choose their primary at the election site. And then they go and vote for whoever. So when these pre-election polls tend to be among, obviously, people who are registered as Republicans. So that doesn't really count the 4,000 or so Democrats who switched parties to vote the Republican, and then just independents who are a huge swing bloc. So we don't know what that would be like. Biden is a write-in because he and the Democratic National Committee tried to strong-arm New Hampshire and out of being an early primary state, and so a lot of people are pissed off at him. So this could theoretically be a way for someone to express it, and at any rate, as I was mentioning before, it's kind of the last chance for that expression to come out, at least plausibly in our worldview. Peter, is there anything in particular you're looking for besides more liquor distillation from presidential candidates?
Oh, yeah, just more opportunities to drink because I don't have enough. No, the thing that I am looking for here is that this should be the final nail in the coffin of the theory that the way to beat Trump in the Republican Party is to have a one-on-one race with a clear contrast. Because we're going to have that, and Trump is going to win.
Fair enough.
There is at least I guess there's a very, very outside chance that Nikki Haley could win in New Hampshire, though I really don't think so. But Trump is going to win the nomination, and he's going to win it in what amounts to a one-on-one race. And that has been the thing that the Never Trumpers, who I have many sympathies for in many ways, I think they are correct about the character of Trump in so many ways, but it is just not at all clear. In fact, forget not at all clear. It is, in fact, clear that in a one-on-one race, Trump still wins. And that, I think, was always going to be the case in this primary.
All right, let's transition-ish here. Speaking of ish, some libertarian-ish. Elected office holders led by Senator and occasional Reason contributor Rand Paul have launched a hashtag Never Nikki campaign on social media, pointing to her foreign policy hawkishness and also free speech censoriousness. Meanwhile, last Thursday, Donald Trump wrote on Truth Social that, quote, a president of the United States must have full immunity, without which it would be impossible for him or her to properly function. And even events that cross the line must fall under total immunity, or it will be years of trauma trying to determine good from bad. This all comes on the heels of his legal team making the argument in court in one of his several cases that a president cannot be prosecuted for his official acts. Katherine, what, if anything, is wrong with Trump's interpretation of the law?
I find myself always with these type of tweets from him so distracted by the word choice. And I know that that's absolutely not the point here, but let's just pause for a minute. Why did he go with the him, her in this case? Like he's just holding open the possibility that Nikki Haley or Hillary Clinton, I don't know, needs to function under these same conditions. And also the trauma, like that's like very weird kind of like millennial Gen Z use of trauma. Like it just kind of means like something bad and annoying here, I think. But anyway, just wild. This is not a good theory, well grounded in our current legal understanding of the limits of the presidency. It is, in fact, quite possible to function properly without full immunity. Every president so far has done it. So I just think that that's very important to keep in mind. And also that this kind of reverse rationalization is the same thing that we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast, right? Whatever Donald Trump wants, we will reverse engineer a policy proposal or a legal theory or whatever it is to make Trumpism a reality. Trump will increasingly rely on this. He will rely on people to take these type of tweets and put them into action as best they can. And that's not going to be good for the country.
Nick, Rand Paul was asked about this quote and this argument, and he says it's a very specific legal argument, and I'm afraid I'm just not up on it enough to be able to comment.
Oh, he's busy, right? He's busy doing other things like coming up with that Never Nikki hashtag.
Sticks right there on the tongue.
And filming that too. That must have taken a couple of takes at least.
I actually appreciate it when sometimes you see in man on the street interviews when people will be like, I haven't really studied that. I should look into it more. It's something they should absolutely have learned in elementary school. This has that same energy. It has that I know whatever I say into this microphone isn't going to go great for me right now, so I'm just gonna give myself some homework and walk away.
It's being revealed, biblical truths in the Book of Revelation. Matt, Trump is a gremlin is the ultimate stress test for American democracy, and governmental institutions, social and cultural ones as well. He is testing every welded seam, in this roller coaster ride of an election. I could go on, but I think Katherine is about to auto asphyxiate with extended metaphors. And it's a bad theory. It's a stupid theory and nobody takes it seriously. And it may have nothing to do with anything. But Trump is going to be the Republican nominee, and Trump is going to run a tough and dirty campaign against Joe Biden, who, as you started out mentioning, Matt, is very unpopular. So it's going to be a hard-fought election among, if we thought 2016 was, Dracula versus the Wolfman, this is like two even shittier, movie monsters, like third-rate movie monsters coming back to battle it out. So
I love
Trump has won. I mean, on a certain level, just as like an extremist, in all sorts of parts of my life, including thinking this is like incredible. This is, let's go. This is the lowest we can get, and now let's push it a little bit further. So
accelerationism, FTW.
Yeah.
Peter,
he's amenitizing the eschaton.
Peter, can you concretize the eschaton for a second? When Trump makes these arguments, makes these kind of off-the-cuff campaign statements, what is a way to, instead of just catastrophizing the awfulness of the speech, but to imagine how it might translate into government policy?
So that's a good question, because the way that Trump translates things into government policy, based on the 4 years that he was president, is he kind of randomly thinks about stuff and says stuff, and then maybe or maybe not the staffers will follow through on it. And sometimes the staffers will be like, this is a very terrible idea. We definitely can't do this. We might even have to tell Trump, oh, we're working on it, but we're definitely not going to be working on it because we think that this is at best of just a rotten idea, and maybe it's illegal and we don't want to do that. But then sometimes they're like, we're going to definitely put together a bunch of false electors, and we're going to go around to the different states, and we're going to we're going to have this big long scheme, and it's going to be a real thing, and they're really going to try to do it. And it's almost impossible to tell which, but I guess what I would say is if Trump is president a second time, it's probably going to be the latter. The staffers saying, yep, let's go for it more often this time, just because a second Trump term is more likely to have to be staffed by people who are Trump toadies, who are sycophants, who are not people who care all that much about the law, but instead care much more about Trump and empowering Trump. And I think that is something to be worried about.
I do also think, though, a second Trump term's staff will be just generally less competent,
yes,
especially than the first 2 years of Trump's first term.
And we saw that with the fake elector scheme, which was in some ways quite incompetent and yet also really quite worrying.
Yeah. But I think just in general, the taking something from brain fart to national policy, that's going to be less successful in the second term than it was in the first. Probably, frankly, in a second Biden administration as well.
I disagreed with most things that Trump was doing, but he didn't govern as insanely as he talked.
Right, but the theory, at least one theory of that, though, is that it's because of the barrier between insane speech and what actually happened in terms of his governing was the massive apparatus and staff and bureaucracy that it takes to turn a
I don't think it was in the executive
action.
branch. I think it was both in the courts and in Congress.
He did do the Muslim ban within the first week of being president.
And that was when he was staffed at peak competence and peak enthusiasm. And I just don't think that is going to, those conditions are not going to be recreated.
There also has been an effort by Heritage and some other groups to put together people who have some level of bureaucratic competence or at least understanding of how agencies and the executive branch work, and to try and ready them to staff a second Trump term so that they will be, if not exactly extremely experienced, hardened, sort of wizened DC hands, people who have come in with real plans, having read the relevant statutes, having looked at the legislation, people who are not, who are maybe crazy, but who are not idiots. And I don't think we can count on incompetence being a huge barrier to Trump doing terrible stuff in a second term.
Correction, that's the Heirloom Foundation that Peter was referring to. All right.
Yeah.
They don't have to change their logos because it's still the H. It's great.
That's exactly.
And I'm just disappointed the president of Heirloom did not offer Ron DeSantis an internship or offer, you can apply. Our summer internship application process is still open.
Yeah. No high-heeled boots are required. All right. We're going to get to our listener email of the week here in a moment. But first, the world would be a better, freer, and happier place if constitutional protections for private property were taken just a tad more seriously. So says our good friends over at the Institute for Justice, who've just released their new season of their legal history podcast, Bound by Oath. Bound by Oath tells the story of how the Supreme Court has cleared the way for government officials to abuse property rights, to trespass on private land without a warrant, to restrict peaceful and productive uses of property, to seize and keep property without sufficient justification, and much, much more. Featuring interviews not only with scholars and litigators, but also with the real-life human beings behind some of the Supreme Court's most momentous property rights decisions, the new season explores the history behind today's civil rights battles. So plug in Bound by Oath into wherever you get your podcasts. Please start with episode 1. That's Bound by Oath, Institute for Justice, Property Rights. Do it today. You'll be glad you did. All right. A reminder, email your terse queries to roundtable@reason.com.
Your turf queries?
Yes,
are we doing that now,
exclusionary, radical feminist queries to roundtable@reason.com. This one comes from Bob Eder. E-D-E-R. You got to send me a pronunciation guide or else I'm going to go full hungo on you. Eder Bolbash writes in, does anybody on the Reason Roundtable or any employee of Reason, for example, Liz Wolfe on the Roundup, read any news sources other than the New York Times, Washington Post, or Reason? Doesn't seem like it. Has any of you ever considered reading The Economist? To the extent The Economist has a unifying viewpoint, it's much closer to Reason's. You can hear the scoffs already. Then certainly NYT or WAPO. And unlike these other two media sources, The Economist doesn't permit their editorial viewpoint to bleed into its news stories. Really? Even the New York Times slogan betrays their arrogance. All the news that's fit to print. So if it doesn't appear in the NYT, it's not fit to print. I suggest you take the pledge, swear off these liberal American news sources. They're not needed. And rely on some less biased, more substantial sources. Katherine, how do you plead? And what do you read?
I love The Economist, and I do read it. And our letter writer is correct that it's a great publication. I will note that The Economist does not make it easy to link to stuff in The Economist for non-subscribers. So our letter writer might consider that perhaps the presence of Washington Post and New York Times links in, for example, the Roundup is at least partially a function of that.
Ooh. Nick, I heard you scoffing at The Economist. I think those.
I wasn't scoffing at The Economist or the letter writer, Matt Welch. I was scoffing at a memory of you. When you first started working at Reason, and you couldn't in your bones, even in a kind of crypto job interview, you couldn't come to say, yeah, I'm a libertarian. You were like, I'm a economist-style liberal.
Yeah, that's true.
And which I immediately took to mean that you are a long-winded, fat magazine that covers Uzbekistan, like, third division soccer teams.
That's
that are using skull. Yeah, no, but it's like, so that's what I was scoffing at. The Economist has some really good stuff. I think it's become a little bit wokish over time. But for the reasons Katherine talks about, I'm actually, and Katherine, I suspect you are too, unbelievably impressed with the ability of The Economist. And there's a couple of other publications like this where, they link to stuff on Twitter, and then you got to buy a $600 a year subscription that you can't refund after reading the one stupid article you want to read.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, they know what they're doing, and they're one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuously published magazine.
They're just out here knowing their worth. They're like, you got to pay if you want to play. That's how it is.
You get what you pay for. The other quick thing about them is the guy who redesigned them the last time, Eric Spiekerman, who we all loved as the villain in the documentary about the font Helvetica called Helvetica. And there is a villain in that movie, and he's wonderful. He's like Blofeld in a Bond movie.
I honestly can't think of a better that. Put it on his tombstone.
Yeah. He also redesigned Reason. And one of the things he told me, this was back in 2001, what had happened with The Economist, which was interesting, people stopped resubscribing because they couldn't finish the magazine in the 2-week period because it's like a phone.
Yes.
I realize nobody under 50 knows what a phone book is anymore, and they felt like they had let the magazine down. And part of the redesign then was to make people feel like it was okay to just skip like 90% of the magazine, but keep buying it. And obviously that worked.
There's no greater like, self-own, right? Like you have the stack of economists on your desk, just silently staring at you, judging you for not caring enough about Uzbekistan's soccer teams, and you just can't finish them. You can't, but you have to try because otherwise you're a bad person.
I hide them behind the stack of New Yorkers, right? Or
a couple of points. One is that The Economist is the Bloomberg terminal of print magazines. Two, that
in fact, the current editor-in-chief of Bloomberg is a former Economist editor.
Exactly. Another is that my horrible self-descriptor back in the old days was made even worse by Brian Anderson in his book South Park Conservatives 20 years ago, described Matt Welch, a self-described economist-style conservative liberal. I think it was right around then that I was like, okay, I'll just go with libertarian. It's easier.
I have the same formational memory as Nick, only it was when I was writing the little blurbs that we used to run in the front of the magazine for outside contributors, featured contributors in the magazine. And I called you, like, I don't know, I maybe been working for Reason for like 3 months. I didn't really know you from Adam. And one of my opening questions for those blurbs was like, how did you become a libertarian? Or like, what's your interest in libertarianism? And you were immediately like, actually, like it was the worst.
Did he go into a long story about how he used to live in Budapest and Prague?
Important.
And
I just remember
Budapest.
I just remember feeling deeply chastened in the moment and then hanging up the phone and being like, that dick.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now I'm going to go work for the Weekly Standard of the New York Times. I got to get out of this world.
That was the origin story. Damn it. Damn it all to hell. Peter, how do you answer the email?
I mean, obviously, I read The Economist. It's a great publication. My wife used to work at The Economist for many years. She now works at The Washington Post, another great publication. Now, The Economist, the Simpsons joke about The Economist is like Homer will just pick up an issue and he'll always be like, ooh, Indonesia is at a crossroads.
Indonesia is always at a crossroads.
And it always is at a crossroads. And I believe The Economist at one point in like 2006 or something finally did an Indonesia at the crossroads cover just to reference that. So the reason I will defend reading the New York Times is because I'm a news professional. I need to know what is in the news, which means I need to know what the paper of record, what the biggest publications are covering, but also because the New York Times has, especially these days, a scale and a metabolism and an influence, a kind of a centrality to American news and culture that is just not matched by many other publications, and certainly not something like The Economist. As good as The Economist is, if you want to know what happened 3 hours ago, you're not going to go to The Economist. You're going to go to the front page of the New York Times, and that is a big part of its value.
Speak for yourself, hombre. I'm going to go to the Drudge Report like a man.
Yeah, I hear it on the streets, Matt. But that's because we live in New York City, a real
Nick
city.
Nick just leans out the window and finds out what's going on.
I would like to defame The Economist a little bit. I think that there's at least I found this, and maybe I'm speaking alone. I thought I had more of a caucus here among former editors-in-chief and current.
I registered some dissent, Matt Welch. But
which is to say, like, I've loved The Economist, and the formulation of, like, one side says this, the other side says this. The answer, as ever, lies somewhere in the middle. Starts to irritate after the 45th year of reading it. This kind of like the sense of wise man, and also it's starting to change, but lack of bylines and sort of institutional haughtiness, especially when you're editor of Reason. It feels pretty contrasty to the vibe that we've got. But in general, and in refutation of Peter Suderman's MSM-centered viewpoint is I have fallen out of love with almost every single bit of institutional media that I once revered, and it doesn't make me feel great. Like the only publication that I can think of that I look forward to reading, when I don't subscribe, is the New York Post, because it covers local news. It covers the crimes that I want to read about.
Yeah.
And
we are also sorry.
It is it's actually distressing. I have subscribed to many publications over the years, and I'm right now in the midst of the first time in my adult life, actually life, not even as a growing up, where there isn't a print newspaper arriving on my doorstep every day. And I realized late in subscribing to the New York Times that I was not even reading it for the Peter Suderman way. I was just using it to take pictures of the front of what was then the sports section, because every day it was more ridiculous. Like these, one-footed trans athletes in a suburban Texas high school are having a difficult time battling institutional racism. It's just like nothing was about like the sports that happened yesterday at all, and it became ridiculous. There's been a hollowing out of institutions, and we're saying this,
Matt.
On yes, Nick.
We get it. You feel a loss, and what you're feeling a loss of is Sports Illustrated.
Sports Illustrated
ceasing publication.
To be a dick. No, there's been a hollowing out of those media institutions. It's not just personal lamentation. It is the quality of them, as I think, deteriorated so much. Part of this is just industrial. If you look at any trend line of major publications, whether magazines or newspapers or local TV news for that matter, the ad dollars are just horrifyingly dropping off over time. But then the quality that's backing up on it and the mores are not great, Bob. And I think that a lot of the people who within the industry who lament this are mistaking their own workplace demises for the death of democracy, and it's kind of comical almost the way that they do it. Nonetheless, I don't think that it's super great, and most of what I subscribe to are individuals and not institutions, and I think that's strange, and we're in kind of a dislocated moment for media. And
Matt,
at that level,
would you tell me what Sports Illustrated writer was the person who made you first say, like, I want to be a really good journalist or writer? Because Sports Illustrated, for the other two people on this podcast, Sports Illustrated, which for many years, but not in recent times, was such a great publication, and like Mad Magazine or the Village Voice or something, is a starter publication for so many people who ended up being journalists. A beautiful magazine, but it's gone.
Yeah,
Matt, who was the one?
I don't know if there was one. Ron Fimriti. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
Botching his name. I never really liked Frank DeFord too much. I thought it was too
terrible.
Fancy.
Yeah.
But he was great. And also just the quality of the photographs were just astonishing. I had my entire wall was covered with Sports Illustrated covers, and it's dead, and it's not awesome. I think that the institutional media themselves absolutely failed to respond to it. Like it's a success curse type of thing. They made so much money for so long that there was no way that they were going to pivot to what the next thing was going to be, and that's not video. Okay.
Can I, for the sports people out there, I just want to remind them all, go and read whatever you can by Kenny Moore, who was an Olympian.
Oh my God, yeah.
Two-time Olympian, and then he wrote about track and field, which, is like arguably, out of the box, you're like, this is an incredibly boring topic. And he was part of the University of Oregon's track teams under Bill Bowerman, wrote a very bizarre memoir of being coached by Bill Bowerman, who was the co-founder of Nike. Phil Knight was one of Bowerman's things. But I can remember, Matt, a particular story about Philbert Bailly and John Walker, who were the two world record holders in the mile in the 1500 in the run-up to the Montreal Olympic Games, where African athletes boycotted because of New Zealand's participation in a total fake global politics bullshit thing. But he wrote this story of these two epic milers who were so different, but were both from post-colonial English colonies, we're going to have the greatest Olympic mile race of all time, and it never came to be. It's just Kenny Moore is a beautiful writer.
I had forgotten his name, and it's absolutely true. Just fantastic writer, and a damn darn shame.
The dichotomy you draw between institutional media and individual subscriptions, Matt, was addressed really kind of in an interesting way on Ted Gioia. Am I going to pronounce that correctly? Gioia. Apologies to Mr. Gioia. His great Substack, The Honest Broker. He wrote about a month ago about how 2024 will be the year of a big battle in the culture between macro culture and the micro culture. And you can basically understand that in the terms that Matt laid out already. But I think we are already seeing this, and we are seeing the macro culture become much more fragile. The LA Times is about to lay off 20% of its workers. Condé Nast is laying off hundreds of people, basically not quite closing up Pitchfork, which was the biggest music magazine of the last 25 years and a publication that I read every single day, just about since the fall of 1999, which was just a few years after it launched. Hugely influential on me, just sort of as a music consumer, but also as somebody who thought, like, as a way to think about how to build a publication and build an audience. And I think, Matt, you are correct that the microculture, these sort of individual, scattered, fragmented, independent media outlets are going to grow, and we are going to see some really interesting stuff there. But the macro culture also isn't going to go away. It's just so big and so moneyed that even if it shrank by 40% over a couple of years, it would still be huge, and we would still have to pay attention to it. And that's why I will continue to read the New York Times.
And
there was definitely a little bit of this.
The Ted Gioia Substack is fantastic to read, and Substack is obviously a place where it's doing a lot of the admin work so the microculture can flourish. In many ways, this is a triumph of a 90s era Reason vision of, disintermediation. There are costs associated with it. There is something to be said about a mass culture that is truly mass and is the backdrop upon which other people comment. But I feel like in the moment now, like too many of us, and I'm not saying anybody in this conversation, but that we focus on the disintegration and see it as a bad thing. And in fact, it is unbelievably liberating to be able to consume a vast amount of perspectives and points of view, many of which are crazy, and that's great, and many of which are so unbelievably deep and knowledgeable and idiosyncratic and wonderful and weird that we would not have been able to. So let's dance a little bit at the grave of Sports Illustrated and all of those great institutions that have fallen, Matt, like the Buffalo Bills yesterday.
Wide right.
Really,
yeah. Speaking of grave dancing, Argentinian President Javier Milei was in Davos last week giving a speech at the World Economic Forum that had libertarians online gushing as if they were a heritage
as if they were watching Pornhub.
As if it was an heirloom president watching a Trump rally. It was a thing of beauty. 23 minutes. My favorite version, and many people's, was dubbed by AI in Milei's own accent in English. It's awesome. Let's each of us go around the table semi-quickly and talk about one particular part about the speech that you like. Katherine, lead us off.
I enjoyed his brief economic history of the world that he started with, not least because it is more or less the exact recital you would have heard from Ron Bailey or maybe Marian Tupy or maybe me, like this very quick, like, hey, you know how nothing changed economically for humans for basically all of human history, and then, I don't know, all of a sudden capitalism, and then everything was awesome. Like, that's my less elegant summary. But in particular, he just says, like, we should remember that by the year 1800, about 95% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty, and that figure dropped to 5% by the year 2020. The conclusion is obvious. And it's just, that's, not to use but like right into my veins. Like, just right into my veins. And he didn't have to use his 23 minutes in front of these very powerful and important people to do remedial economic history, but I'm very glad that he did, because people needed to hear that.
And Nick, I think that's never Evita.
Oh yeah, never again
Never
for sure.
Evita.
Or Juan. What was to pick up on what Catherine's talking about is, first off, I think a lot of libertarians were like, wait, what's he going to Davos? Is he gonna publicly eat the bugs and like cave or something like that? What I liked about it is where he says, never in all mankind or humanity's history has there been a time of more prosperity than today. So he's not saying like, like 6 weeks ago or 6 years ago was better. It's right now. And he says, the world of today has more freedom, is rich, more peaceful and prosperous. This is particularly true for countries that have more economic freedom and respect for the property rights of individuals. He is looking to the future. He is also talking about the parts of the world that are not old Europe and old North America. It is a radically non-U.S. centered vision of a future of individual freedom, property rights, and the rule of law. This is what we're waiting for, whether he delivers it or not, and whether or not Argentina goes back into being, an awful repressive place that it has been for most of the past century. He is offering a vision of a future that is truly post 20th century. More power to him. I really hope that he can deliver on any of this stuff. But wow, what a speech.
Peter?
So just after the economic history portion that Katherine talked about, he goes on a riff about the problems he sees with what he calls social justice. And I'm just going to read you one little bit from that. He says, those who promote social justice start with the idea that the whole economy is a pie that can be shared differently. But that pie is not a given. It's wealth that is generated in what Israel Kurtzner, for instance, calls a market discovery process. So it's just delightful to hear things like that being said, period. But this sort of goes to the thing that Katherine was talking about, which is his emphasis on economic growth. And not just a kind of Jeb Bushian economic growth of like, it would be great if we had 4% growth every year because then the deficit wouldn't really be a problem. No, his idea is that through economic growth, we can have a better future. The future can be more wonderful for more people. And he directly contrasts that with this idea that I think is really pervasive amongst a lot of people who just don't understand what economic growth is. I think there's a real fundamental, like he has identified that there is a fundamental failure in the world to get what the value of economic growth is. And because so many people just see the world and the economy and the distribution of resources as something that is fixed, as something that is here, this is what we've got, and now we've got to figure out how to divide that up. And he says, well, that's what social justice tries to do. And his argument is through growth, through a market economy, through freedom, through government not getting in the way, we can have a bigger pie. We can have more, just more pie for everyone.
Finally.
Right? It's all pie all the way down. And it's a great sort of pie-based theory of the future and of prosperity, but it is also the thing that Ron DeSantis didn't offer. And just to tie this back to our initial conversation, this is a vision of a better world through a kind of idea about what governance is and could be and should be. And that is something that we just don't have certainly in the Republican Party, but really at the top levels of American politics at all right now. And that's why this speech is so heartening to watch and to read.
I would say also it's not just what government could and should be, but what government shouldn't be, should just not be, and stop trying to be, and stop trying to twiddle the knobs on life. It's a big part of the message. I like two bits of it. One, piggybacking what Peter just said, he just relentlessly throughout the speech enumerated what growth means. If you grow at 1.5% rate, then you are going to double the economy in X number of years. And any time that the growth rate changed in the speech, he paused to let us know how many years it would take to double prosperity on a per capita basis. It's just fantastic. Like
two pies rather than one pie.
Lots of pie.
Because there really is, like, I feel this too. Like, you have this sense if you could just get people to understand that concept, that like everyone would be a libertarian. You could feel in his speech that he was like, again, I just want to be clear. This math is not intuitive, but it's the most important math. One more time, growth rates and what they mean. And it's like, actually, that's not going to convince people is my like sad later in life realization. But I felt that feel. I wanted somehow someone at Davos to like hear those numbers and be like, oh my God, I get it now.
The other part I liked is his absolutely explicit cribbing of the Declaration of Independence, which is a really good piece of writing and a way it's good. It was talking about we're endowed by our creator by life, liberty,
he meant the original one, not the book one.
And but instead of saying, of course, the pursuit of happiness, he said property, getting the proprietarians all excited out there. But it's very bracing to hear those words, as always, especially when they light a fire under people who are not Americans. All right, let's get to our end of podcast, what we have been consuming out there in the world. Nick, why don't you lead us off?
Well, Milei was in a Rolling Stones cover band, right? And I am kind of wondering what his favorite Stone song is. And, we could talk about that for a couple of hours, and I'm sure we will at some point. Or Start Me Up, which is a terrible song, but it seems thematic. Waiting on a Friend. He's not waiting on a friend, Matt. Or a lady. He's going out there and making things happen.
I think it's Jiving Sister Fanny.
Yeah.
That's probably the one.
So I'm in a rock and roll frame of mind, and I have been reading Lightning Striking 10 Transformative Moments in Rock and Roll by Lenny Kaye, the 9-foot-tall guitarist for the Patti Smith Group, who also put together the anthology in the early 7 Nuggets, which kind of made garage rock and kind of, lo-fi psychedelia a thing in the early 70s. This book is fantastic. 10 different scenes for rock music, kind of broadly defined, but recognizable. Starts in Cleveland, 1952, with kind of creation or popularization of the term. Goes through various places, including Philadelphia in 1959. And Dick Clark and American Bandstand, which started there and then before migrating to the left coast, Liverpool. There is an absolutely fantastic chapter where he discusses kind of all the different things that were coming together in New York in 1975, which is the scene that gave rise to the Patti Smith Group and is kind of the transitional moment between older rock forms and punk. And then one of the things that sold me on this book, just as being full genius, he writes about Norway 1993 and kind of black death metal and the violence, literal violence and kind of murder that took place in the kind of death rock black metal scene in Scandinavia, in Nordic, and then of course it ends with Seattle of 1991 when Nirvana and other bands broke through, and it's kind of caps an era because rock and roll is really not it's not an aesthetics. It's really probably best understood as a historical period. But what's great about this book, Lightning Striking, is you don't have to be into the music. That helps, but it talks about how scenes happen and why they happen and all the different kind of cultural and social and artistic and intellectual, sociological, personal conflicts and kind of affiliations that just give rise to a moment where people kind of during it and certainly after it are like, wow, something really special happened here. And it was kind of beautiful, even if it didn't last. And it's kind of great to think about that in the context of the 2024 election, because this is like a complete clusterfuck. It's a mudslide that will end, but it's kind of like, okay, as we're heading into November of 24, which is, just going to be one of the worst political seasons imaginable. Like, where do we find the stopping points, where we grab twigs or branches or grass or rocks sliding down the mountain to, have a moment where something new can start to form and where we can come up with a different place and a different way to go. Lightning Striking, Lenny Kaye.
Katherine, I'm just going to you next to save us from the metaphors.
Thank you. I saw the new Mean Girls movie. And for those who are not paying attention, Mean Girls, the original, was adapted into a musical. This is the movie adaptation of the musical adaptation of the movie. And I want to say that the group of gals that I went with, over half of them did not realize it was going to be a musical until right before we walked in the door, which was too bad for them. I did not think it was a great movie. However, I'm going to offer these thoughts. It's National School Choice Week this week, Matt. I don't know if you know that.
Oh, I was going to do that later.
And
thank you for preempting.
Mean Girls really puts you in a frame of mind to think about whether maybe a lot of the horrors of that big, dumb public high school in that movie could be avoided with, I don't know, maybe like education more suited to the individual needs and desires of different students. Maybe it doesn't actually make a lot of sense to take every 16-year-old in a certain square mile radius and dump them into one building and force them to get along, because they're not going to. And that does not duplicate conditions in the real world at all. Mostly, I just was like longing for Janice, who you will recall is the kind of counterculture arty friend. I like just wanted her to be at a magnet school or a charter school or a private school for arty friends. You know, I mean, that would have been better for everyone. So Mean Girls is a important document about school choice, is my extremely reasoned take.
If we
on the
had
movie.
school choice, there would be like no youth culture left, right? Which would be
Great.
kind of good.
Sign me up. Yeah, I mean, you know, the iconic scene at the beginning where we're getting a tour of the lunchroom, and it talks about how all the different school subcultures self-isolate. And when they are forced into contact, how it goes like stupidly and badly.
So that's what happened on social media 10 years, 20 years later?
Yeah, basically. So yeah, this is, for those who are interested, I would say they actually did a pretty decent job of keeping the jokes of the original intact. They could have gone much more milquetoast. They could have taken out a lot more of the like semi-politically incorrect humor of the initial version. They softened it in a couple places, and they did cut out some of the best lines, but honestly, like quite a decent job of preserving the spirit of the original. Just sometimes you don't need to break into song to drive home the point that Halloween is just a time to wear lingerie and animal ears. You could just say that line.
As someone who's never going to see that movie, though I liked the original movie, I liked a lot Kat Rosenfield's essay about it in Unheard, and I recommend that to people. Peter, what did you consume?
I have been watching For All Mankind Season 4. So For All Mankind is an alternate history series about the space race. It's by Ron Moore, the creator of the Battlestar Galactica reboot and a major Star Trek writer in the 1990s. The first scene in the very first season of For All Mankind is set in the big NASA control room, and it's sort of buzzing. People are like, well, it's about to happen. What's about to happen? It's a big deal. It's really going to... And then they all look up at the screen, and a man steps foot on the moon for the first time. And the man is a Russian. And this is the premise of the show is what if Russia beat the United States to the moon? And then each season sort of develops, goes from there, jumping ahead by a full decade. So the fourth season is set in the mid-aughts, I think 2003 or so, in a world where America and Russia and North Korea somehow, it's complicated, have sort of, they have a shared base on Mars. But it's not just governments who are operating up on Mars. There's also a private space company run by a sort of kind of Elon Musk type, except maybe a little more sympathetic. And everything ends up being this kind of complex negotiation between these great powers and this big corporation, the private sector. And For All Mankind is not in any way a libertarian show. I don't want to mean that. I don't want to present this as like, oh, here's a show that is explicitly about the Reason magazine ideals and value set. There is, for example, a relatively sympathetic subplot this season about the formation of a union and a strike on Mars. Although it does recognize that the strike goes badly in a bunch of ways and like ends up causing a bunch of strife and even death. But it is a show about pushing forward into a different world and embracing a kind of a frontier mindset about exploration and growth. And it seems to like really have in its heart, its big idea is that kind of exploration, the frontier is what we need to grow as humans and as a species. And that without the frontier, we are living lives that are less than they could be. And so in that, I think it is a show that libertarians will appreciate, even if it is not being produced directly from an explicitly libertarian perspective. It's just nicely written with a bunch of interesting, smart characters.
Speaking of Cold War competition, I saw a documentary from a couple years ago called A Compassionate Spy. It's about a guy who was an 18-year-old working on the Manhattan Project named Ted Hall, who, because he was worried about the U.S. having a monopoly on atomic power, smuggled out secrets about it to the Soviet Union and never got caught. It's a fascinating documentary. It is more one-sided than a New York Times sports article about what's happening in Texas. It is astonishing. I mean, it's called A Compassionate Spy. That kind of gives you a hint of its sympathies. It has access to the guy who died a few years ago, but there was footage of him talking. But it's with his wife, Joan, who she was communist, socialist. They had to cover their tracks and their organizings over the years. But it's all portrayed as pure idealism, as opposed to the horrifyingly knuckle-dragging, paranoid anti-communists of the time who, it should be pointed out, were right about a lot of stuff, including the existence of Soviet spies in places. So it's really like, it takes you a while. For me, the moment that I watched it on a plane, I had no idea really about the backstory. If you're into Oppenheimer and all that kind of stuff, it's fun and interesting. But the moment that you go, oh, wait a second, it's really one-sided, is that the wife is talking about how, like, well, Americans, so, we all had a really favorable opinion of the Soviet Union. For instance, we all watched, A Mission to Moscow during the war, and it had a really, positive view. Mission to Moscow, if you've never seen it, and I actually hadn't seen clips of it before. I'd heard about it a lot, because I have way too much proximity to people like Michael Moynihan. But it's a U.S. propaganda movie about Moscow that's filmed. It's based on a thing by the former U.S. ambassador there. It is so bad. It's like the most comically bad, over-the-top propaganda. Oh, you are saying that women here have the equal rights. Yes, we have the equal right. It's so bad. And it's presented as like, oh, this is obviously like good. This is just an emblematic of how America finally understood the truth about the Soviet Union. So it's like that. So it's super one-sided, but that one side is pretty interesting. Weird lives of these people. And like, I am fascinated by how they didn't get caught because they were rung in. If you remember Oppenheimer, if that's your freshest of mind thing, part of the movie is about him being kind of cross-examined in the early 1950s, I think it was, or maybe the late 40s, early 50s, about his role and like whether he was around spies and things. The Ted Hall got roped in for those same kinds of interrogations with those same kinds of people, and he just looked at them and lied, and he got out of it, and he never got prosecuted. It came out, I think, in the Venona transcripts in the early 90s, that he was indeed a spy, and he came out and said, "Yeah, late in life," and there's a moment like they're always when they ever get the other side in there, they find the guy with the craziest eyes and teeth saying, "Well, he should have been shot. That's what I think." And I'm going like, well, shot seems like a lot, but like, I don't know, punished or something. Anyways, people from all sides will find it interesting. It is absolutely not a fair-minded documentary at all, but sometimes those can have access and be interesting on their own. So a Compassionate Spy. Steve James is the guy. It's Participant Media, which is always super political. Weird, interesting.
What did they ask you to do afterwards? Participant Media is famous for, coming up with social action campaigns.
Yeah. Thankfully, I didn't see it in the theater where there would be like a pep talk and marching orders coming after.
But you saw it on a plane, so did you cry?
No, I didn't. I saved that for, I believe, watching Reese Witherspoon's Wild. Just,
Wow.
come on. It's tough out there in 1994. All right, that's all the time we have for our airplane movie crying. Go to all of our podcasts, reason.com podcasts. Nick Gillespie, who does some of those podcasts, you also do events in New York. Are there any that are still at this late date advertisable?
No.
Okay, very good. Katherine, do you want to soliloquize one last little bit about National School Choice Week and what Reason's involvement and is about?
Yeah, it's a delightful celebration every year, and the point is just to kind of take a moment to think about, draw attention to the importance of school choice. You may have seen the fine folks who run National School Choice Week and in their yellow scarves. They wear cute yellow scarves every year. We've got some great articles by Jerry Tuccilli and a few other things planned for Reason's website. So do stop in if you care about the children, Matt.
Never children. Okay, we'll catch you next week. Have a safe and sane New Hampshire primary. Goodbye.